Welcome back to Backyard Science. My name is Liz, and today we are going to continue with our week's theme of looking at different levels of a food web. And I'm going to be talking about secondary and tertiary consumers. So, what are those? They sound really confusing. So, a secondary consumer is actually an organism that will eat a primary consumer for energy. And I think in the previous video, Nikki already discussed what is a primary consumer. So this is just sort of that next level up, and tertiary consumers are just above secondary consumers. So secondary consumers eat primary consumers, tertiary consumers eat secondary and primary consumers. What can be kind of special about those last two categories, the secondary and tertiary consumer, is they can kind of sort of change depending on how you look at them. So an example is a pig. So if a pig is eating a plant, then they're a primary consumer. But if they eat an insect or a fish, which they themselves are primary consumers, then the pig is a secondary consumer. So it really kind of depends on your perspective and how you're looking at the animal and what sort of food web they're in. So it kind of gives you an idea of how interconnected and really confusing a food web can get very quickly. And this really demonstrates the concepts of ecology, is that everything in the environment is interconnected and the relationships are really dependent on different types of circumstances, and how it is just so sort of difficult to tease apart those relationships because they're just dependent on so many different factors. And we're going to get a good chance to kind of see what a secondary consumer looks like here at home in just a minute.
So what is an example of a secondary consumer? So here we have a perfect opportunity to showcase my two dogs. They actually will eat just about anything, and here I'm feeding them some turkey. So when they're eating the turkey, they are actually secondary consumers. But my dogs will just as happily eat carrots. And when they're eating the carrots, they actually become primary consumers because they're eating plants. So it's kind of tricky to sort of pinpoint exactly what an animal is, because it'll really depend on their relationship in the ecosystem, what it is that they're eating, to sort of determine if they're a primary consumer or a secondary consumer or even a tertiary consumer. So as my dogs are omnivores, it really sort of depends on what they're eating, what kind of consumer they are. Let's use a game to show how trophic levels interact and maintain a balanced ecosystem. First, we're starting off with a strong, stable ecosystem that has high biodiversity. Biodiversity means there are a lot of species that fulfill the same role. So there are many different plants, decomposers, and types of consumers in this ecosystem. To demonstrate biodiversity for the game, there are 3 blocks across in each trophic level, except for the secondary and tertiary consumers, because there are less of these animals and ecosystems. But what happens when I start taking some of the species away from each level? For this example, I'm just going to go ahead and stack them on top. What do you think will happen? What if I were to completely remove one trophic level? What if I were to remove the tertiary consumers from the ecosystem? Despite the top part collapsing, the ecosystem itself remains intact and stable. This shows how important diversity is to an ecosystem. It protects the system from falling apart. Let's reset, but without the high diversity. Now what do you think will happen if I change something in the ecosystem? I could change the number of decomposers or primary consumers. But let's say we're going to do a change to the abiotic factors. What if this ecosystem had to deal with a changing climate? How do you think the system will react? So ecosystems can be fragile. They are interconnected at every level and maintain a balance between species. But when we change too many things, like reducing biodiversity and impacting the climate, we can risk ecosystem collapse.
An important concept of food webs is the trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is the impact one trophic level has on another. A well-known example of a trophic cascade occurred in Yellowstone National Park. In the park, wolves were tertiary consumers, eating elk, who are primary consumers that ate plants. Many years ago, when wolves disappeared from Yellowstone, the number of elk increased very quickly. With so many elk, they overate many plants, such as aspens, willows, and grasses, which changed how the park looked and how its ecosystem functioned. When the wolves returned many years later, the population of elk decreased, and the plants in Yellowstone returned closer to normal. So, the loss of this one trophic level, the tertiary consumers who are wolves, can greatly impact other trophic levels, and this is a trophic cascade.